Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the entire team at Curl for inviting me today. I'm really excited to be here. Any opportunity to talk to family, which is what Curl is to me. I am thoroughly excited, and I see some folks like Mary and William on the call, and Dr. Rosenblatt. Thanks for joining. Dr. Rosenblatt was a chair on my dissertation committee, so it's really exciting to have you here. And I'm hoping for this to be a conversation. So yes, I'm happy to hold questions until the end, but please do feel free to insert your comments or questions in the chat, and also use some of the functions, like some of the reaction buttons, since most of you will be muted, or all of you will be muted during this. Let me know what's on your mind through some of those functions that we have at the bottom of the screen. So wanted to first introduce myself, Jennifer Cossyleon. I was a Curl Fellow for 6 years while I was a graduate student in the Department of Sociology at Loyola Chicago. And while I was at Curl, I worked on many evaluations with community partners. It's really where I learned so many of the skills of engaged research, and my love for research grew. My love for working with communities and thinking with communities to develop research that addresses community grounded questions, and to work on projects with people who are working to make a better world, make their communities better. And so it was such an honor and privilege to do that. I worked on a few projects that involved youth reentry programs, parent leadership programs through community organizing, which led me to meeting the site where I conducted my dissertation, Community Organizing and Family Issues, which looked at the relationship between kinship and organizing and the ways in which organizing shaped kinship and vice versa. As well as looking at innovative programs through the Cook County Deferred Prosecution Program to prevent criminal records, which we know really hinder people's ability to thrive socially and economically, as well as the Security Deposit Assistance Program, actually with Professor Rosenblatt, who's on the call today, to understand how a Security Deposit Assistance Program would help people who have a housing choice voucher move to areas of higher opportunity, since we know that many people who have housing choice vouchers tend to live in areas of higher poverty. So after I graduated from Loyola in 2018, I co-directed the final year of a study in Baltimore with Dr. Stephanie DeLuca and Dr. Catherine Eden, along with like Phil Garbodin, Dr. Phil Garbodin as well, and Dr. Christine Jane. And this study looked at investment and divestment in Baltimore through the Poverty and Inequality Research Lab. We talked to organizers, renters, homeowners, investors, landlords, and also principals, school principals. And we tried to unpack how investment and divestment affected the lives of people living in the community. And so what we're finding is that unequal investment, really affects how people experience, and in some cases are pushed out, but in other cases you're able to do community investment in a way that doesn't cost displacement. And so what are the mechanisms of doing that is really important. I'm working on a paper now that is digging more into the principals' experiences and how unequal investment affects enrollment and then how that also reproduces inequity in many ways, where principals are left having to recruit students as opposed to really planning for their curriculum and ensuring that that they're engaging with parents and students, as opposed to trying to just keep their building open and afloat due to per pupil funding systems. In addition to doing over 400 interviews through that project, we also did systematic social observations, and we surveyed residents and upgraded units to try to understand who was moving into newly renovated properties. And so that leads me to where I am now, which is at Community Change and Community Change Action, where I'm currently a Mellon ACLS Public Fellow through that program. Community Change is a host site for the program. So basically, the Mellon Foundation and ACLS fund my 2 years at Community Change, and the host site has been just a wonderful transition from doing research to really working on policy and advocacy around many of the areas that are important to me. Studying poverty and inequality, studying the ways in which groups contest at the grassroots, and how kinship and family is integral to all of these parts. And so Community Change is a national social justice organization whose theory of change is that we need to build power from the ground up. And we do this by expanding our base and our leadership. And so we work with over 200 organizations across the country to do that. We also are a convener of groups. And so we bring groups together. This used to be much more in person, but we have transitioned to do virtual convenings to meet the moment. And we, for instance, have a coalition of 47 organizations across the country working on immigration. So this is through the Fair Immigration Reform Movement. We also have a housing trust fund project that supports 16 current housing trust fund campaigns, but has helped hundreds of campaigns start off and continue to thrive throughout the country. Currently, there's about 800 housing trust funds around the country. And so I'm happy to talk about any of these parts and even go back further to undergrad. If there's some undergrads on the call, and how I engaged in local, state, and federal government through internships and fellowships back in the day. And so today I'm here to talk about the New Deal for housing. And so if we can maybe start sharing the slides. We can, okay, great. So the New Deal for housing is a bold vision for housing policy that centers racial equity. And so it is designed as a playbook, which was created with input from over 100 stakeholder interviews and more than 400 ideas from grassroots leaders, from people living in the community, as well as from advocates. It was designed as a blueprint for the organization, for the organization as well, but mainly for the new administration, the new incoming administration, to really center racial equity in housing with support from the Ford Foundation. And so this project really challenges our government to create housing policy that works for people who most need access to housing. It's ultimately, how we see it, about rebalancing power, because a major form of instability in America is housing insecurity. And so the New Deal for Housing Justice, AKA the Playbook, which is, the name has stuck because it was initially called the Playbook Project, was created as a guide for the new administration. But as a whole, I think it does a good job of pointing to the many ways in which housing intersects with virtually every aspect of family life, and how racial inequity within housing has impeded so many families from accessing better opportunities, and really in turn giving concrete policy solutions to how to undo these harms. And so on the next slide, we'll see a roadmap for today, where I'll begin by telling you about some of the foundations of the New Deal for housing, and what are some of the key aspects of this very large document. I think it's, last I looked at it, it was over 150 pages. Share some of the top policy recommendations, as well as the nitty-gritty of how it was rolled out with our partners across the country, and then tell you about some of the exciting actions that are happening from our partners, as well as some of the upcoming plans that we have to continue to push this forward. It really emphasizes both short-term and long-term goals for housing at the federal level. And although the emphasis was really on the first 200 days, which I think we are somewhere around 60 days, if I'm not mistaken, someone correct me, into the new administration. And so on the next slide, we'll see some of the guiding principles of, here we go, some of the guiding principles of the playbook, which really begin with seeing housing as a human right. It is a basic human need that everybody should have access to, as opposed to seeing housing as a commodity. Housing is a public good. When everybody is housed, we are all better for it. And this has been made explicitly clear, especially during this pandemic, where having a place to live, to shelter in place, helps the spread of COVID-19. It saves people's lives. And so, this has just been reemphasized through our national crisis and epidemic. Housing is a pathway to equity, and housing affects so many aspects of your life. It affects where your kids go to school. It affects your access to healthcare, where you go get your groceries if you have a store nearby. It affects your prospects of employment. It affects whether or not there's public transportation for you to nearby for you to get to work. So many different areas. And so if we can focus on making housing policy more equitable, then we can also at the same time affect so many other factors like health and economic stability, for instance. Housing policy must put people first, and this has to be front and center. It should not be profit, right? It should be human lives that are valued and put first. And it also should really strive to ensure that people with lived experiences are creating policies, implementing policies, because people who have experienced homelessness, people who live in public housing, people who've had housing insecurity have lived it themselves, and who better than to craft programs to ensure that many of the barriers that people face to access support and help are thought of. And so there's a very big emphasis on making sure that people with lived experiences are at the fore of conversations and are not doing it just on a one-time basis of advising, right? Are really hired, for instance, by the administration to work at HUD, to run programs, to be continuously part of the conversation, and to be compensated for that as well. And the last is that we need to be equity focused. We need to reckon with the fact that housing has been one of the ways in which racial inequity has been perpetuated. We need to recognize that and take measures to to rectify. And so the New Deal for Housing, I should mention, was put together in large part by senior fellow Lynn Ross, and the advisory committee included many people. I was part of the advisory committee, but I did not contribute to the playbook as an author. There were, I believe, 13 contributing authors in total, as well as external reviewers. The project was co-chaired by our president at Community Change, Dorian Warren, and from the Ford Foundation, Maria Torres Springer, as well as former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Julian Castro. On the next slide, you'll see town hall last summer of 2020, where Julian Castro, as well as some of our community partners, had a conversation about how housing was essential and housing was a basic human need. And so this really kicked off the process of this huge endeavor to nail down recommendations for the new administration that center racial equity. And so at this event, leaders with lived experience talked to Secretary Castro about their vision for housing. And they shared stories of living in public housing and experiencing homelessness. Brooke Fadley shared a story of illness and losing her job, being unable to work because of her illness, and couch surfing ever since, 6 times in her life ever since then. And also leaders talked about housing as a racial inequity issue. And so on the next slide, we'll see an overview of the sections of the New Deal for Housing. There's 11 sections. And although section 1 is racial justice, these are all racial justice, or the goal of racial justice is incorporated in all the sections. And so there are overall 118 recommendations. They're very short and succinct. They're meant to be developed with communities with lived experiences. So all the particularities of the policies are not included, but rather more of the bold ideas are presented. In some cases, there are budgetary allocation suggestions and needs that are included. One example is, we know we have about $75 million in backlog of public housing. And so that is explicitly listed. Another example is housing trust funds are underfunded. And so we need $20 billion to housing trust funds at the national level. So those kinds of things are in there. But for the most part, they're really designed to be bold ideas that can be constructed in collaboration with people with lived experiences. And so throughout the playbook, the racial implications of housing inequity are highlighted. And then the next slide, you'll see a very, very high overview of how race has played a major role in housing through white supremacy and systemic racism. And some of these I'll show more close up so that we can see them closer. I know that here it's probably really tiny on your screen, but the first is segregation and how this has been a project of racially segregating people through redlining, which affects mortgage lending, and as well as creating public housing that racial and economically segregated people in high-rise buildings, and as well as now, which is moving more towards housing choice vouchers without tenant protections, which leaves tenants looking for people to rent to them, for landlords to rent to them, and often end up living in areas of higher poverty. Ta-Nehisi Coates wrote in The Atlantic, which featured Jack McNamara, rest in peace, his work with the Contract Buyers League in the late 60s, who helped over 400 families negotiate really bad mortgage terms and contracts that left them vulnerable to losing their homes. And so this happened to thousands of families across the country where, due to policy, they were unable to buy homes, and if they were, they had really bad terms that really left them vulnerable to losing their homes if they missed just one payment. And so coupled with this segregation, we see this disinvestment in so many different areas. So one area is in public housing. Due to the Fair Cloth Amendment, I think is of what is it, the 1937 Housing Act. We're not building any new public housing anymore. And the public housing we currently have, we don't upkeep. And so we lose thousands of units each year just because they're unlivable, and we don't build them again. Instead, like I mentioned, we're moving more towards a voucher system, which at the same time, only 1 in 4 families who's eligible for a voucher receive them. And so there's been this disinvestment in public housing. There's been disinvestment in education, in health, in economic stability, in so many different areas that have been shown to be determinants of health and social thriving. Here at the bottom, we see a store that was closed, and it was closed for like 6 or 7 years. This is on the south side of Chicago, or the west side, and it just remained closed. It was a grocery store, and it remained closed. And so we see, in communities where there's been a lot of disinvestment, which affects the community as a whole and affects the people living there. And instead, what we've done in many ways is we've criminalized poverty, and we've incarcerated people for nonviolent offenses. And as a result, this also bars them from accessing opportunities for housing as well as employment. And so I said it was going to be short, but here we are. We're in this housing crisis, and we have hundreds of thousands of people who are homeless, many who are at risk of homelessness. Currently, anywhere from 10 to 40 million people are at risk of homelessness at the moment. We have a housing system that is not affordable. There's not a metro area in the entire United States where a person working minimum wage can afford a 2-bedroom unit, make working full time. And so we also see this in the racial wealth gap, as well as the gap in homeownership and how this is divided across racial lines. And so in the next slide, you'll see closer up of how housing vouchers continue to segregate families, and families continue to live in areas with higher opportunity. The little orange dots that you see on the screen represent 100 households receiving a voucher. And so you can see that those are largely in the south and west side of the city. And housing vouchers is used to help people pay a portion of their rent, which is paid directly to the landlord. And there's about 5 million people who receive a housing voucher. And so, the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities has a really great interactive map where you can go to any metro area in the US, and you can see where folks who have a housing choice voucher, where they live in, and how it continues to segregate people in areas of higher poverty. In the next slide, we can see a closer view of that map. And I just did a screenshot of Illinois as an example. We rank 18th in terms of our housing wage. And so we would need to work 72 hours each. Is this, I can't, it's really tiny. Let me see if hopefully this is better. We'd have to work 72 hours. Yeah, that is each week. 72 hours each week to be able to afford a 1-bedroom rental at fair market rent. And so this just shows how housing is so unaffordable. And this isn't just something happening in Chicago or in Illinois. It is, it is happening across the country. This map here that you see shows the whole United States, and the dark blue is where the dark blue is the hourly wage required to afford a 2-bedroom rental home. And so in the dark blue, it says that an hourly wage that's needed to afford a home in those areas is about $20, right? Like we've seen the fight around making $15 minimum wage at the federal level, continue. And this is just one key example of how, housing affordability is an issue, but I want to really make clear that just solving the issue of making more houses affordable isn't going to get us where we want to be, because it doesn't reckon with the racial injustice that is at the core of our housing crisis. And so really want to ensure the state to highlight that we really need to work at the systems level, because just adding more affordable housing units is a great step in the right direction, but it is not going to undo the racial injustice that occurs in our country. And so we need to do both simultaneously. And so I'll tell you more about what I mean. In the next slide, you'll see some of the top recommendations in the playbook, and then I'll discuss these more in detail as we continue. So the first is, delivering a COVID relief that remedies the housing insecurities, particularly focusing on communities of color, and making sure that communities who have been devastated by the pandemic, which have really exacerbated their housing insecurities, are those who are first to receive assistance. We know that women, particularly women of color, have fared the brunt of losing jobs. Many who were in service or retail occupations, or caregiving occupations, and as well as just the racial and health implications. More people of color disproportionately get COVID-19 and die from COVID-19. And this has a lot to do with access, and then how they are treated, how people of color are treated once they are in care. And so, really making sure that COVID relief is targeted and it's reaching families who most need it. Other priority areas are, making reparations for a legacy of anti-Black federal housing, intentionally segregating communities of color, and doing, establishing a commission to undo this. And so this is something that is often, criticized as, well, do we need another commission, another study? And, it's a starting point, and it shows, I see like Maya saying yes to reparations. It shows a commitment from the administration to do something about it, and to recognize and to make strides to have an actionable plan. And so this commission ideally would end with an actionable plan, and not just study it, but actually have a really good set of guidelines for ensuring that this happens. Other ideas are creating a refundable renters tax credit. Homeowners get tax credits every year when they file their taxes. Renters don't get any of that money back. Making housing choice vouchers universals, which means everybody who qualifies should be able to receive assistance. And so, like I said before, 1 in 4 families who qualify are able to get the help that they need, as well as making sure that there are protections like source of income discrimination protections for tenants, and that we are upholding fair housing laws. And so all of these protections are needed in addition to more funding. 2 others that I want to highlight before going deeper into some of these are, researching and implementing a pilot of a universal basic income program. And we've seen some of this already with the economic stimulus cash payments, and how just putting money in people's hands without telling them what they need to use it for, I think is just like in general, like good practice. Like we have this practice of policing people who have economic insecurity. And so why do we have a middleman program like the housing choice voucher, to directly give the money to landlords? Like, why can't we think about giving money to people instead of spending, billions of dollars to run programs, when in the end, all we want is to help people have money to pay rent, right? And so thinking about universal basic income, it's something that we could talk about, and we can get into a little later with, with the expansion of the child tax credit that just passed last week through I keep calling it ERA, the Economic Recovery Plan. No, American Recovery Plan. I'm trying to, I work too much in acronyms now. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what that had, but the expansion of the child tax credit, which is going to do monthly payments to families with children, a total of up to $3,600 per child if they're under 5. And so this is in many ways a test of showing that this is possible. And so exploring some of these options are part of what the New Deal for Housing Justice uplifts. And so on the next slide, you can see some of the areas that I'll be focusing on to talk a little bit more. First is structural change, systems change. The second is, where do we need to invest in the budget? Where do we, for this upcoming infrastructure bill that's going to happen likely through budget reconciliation process, which just happened, which is how the rescue plan just passed as well, will likely pass again. And then last is the COVID-19 response. And then tied to that is the administrative actions that could be done right away, and some of which have happened. And so we could talk about that. And so if we can go to the next slide, you can see, we'll start with systems change. And so in order to really try to look at things more systemically, as opposed to focusing on the issue of housing instability as an individual problem, as something that like people are just not working hard enough, and that is why they have housing insecurity, or people are just not looking enough for an affordable housing unit, right? And so really putting that to individuals, as opposed to recognizing that the system really sets up many people to fail. And so looking at, at this as an intersectional framework, as well as having the systemic analysis. And intersectional framework means that we're looking at the ways in which housing is connected to health and education and employment and economic stability and security. And so, viewing housing within a broader justice framework, and ensuring that housing intersects with social safety net programs, criminal justice system, and many other policy areas. So we can't silo housing policy from others. Bold change that has to do with, committing to a federal homes guarantee to build 12 million housing units. It means that we are committed to eradicating homelessness. It means that we want to protect and ensure that renters are protected through a national tenant bill of rights, rent caps, tenant screening protections like source of income discrimination. So people who have housing vouchers, for instance, are able to find landlords to rent to them and have the law on their side when they're doing their searches for a place to live. Another thing that came up in terms of structure cultural change is creating an Office of Equitable and Resilient Communities, making sure that we have coordination between local, regional approaches to housing, health, mental health included, economic development, and mobility, again, focusing on reducing racial and economic disparities. Again, lived experiences, making sure that people who had lived experiences of living in public housing are crafting programs and implementing and overseeing initiatives at HUD and in the administration, as well as UBI pilot without red tape, really. It's, not adding work requirements, which is what we've tended to do, after the 90s, where we reformed our welfare system, is where we said, well, if you want to receive help, then you have to work. But guess what? We're not going to give you any help for childcare. We're not going to give you a job. You have to go find one. And really what this did is created a disposable workforce that has to work for, very little, with very little protections. And so, saying no to that, saying people just deserve to have housing, and a universal basic income is one way of achieving that without all of these hoops that people have to jump through. And then, like I mentioned before, making reparations to Black people for a legacy of anti-Black housing. And the next slide, we'll see more in terms of the budget. All of these overlap, and in many ways, many of these will need to have money investment in them. But these are just three buckets that we can sort some of the recommendations in the Housing Justice Playbook. Centering racial housing justice in the president's budget, right? Federal housing must be planned, designed, budgeted, operated as a public good, and needs to center anti-discriminatory ways of doing that. We need to ensure that the president's budget has investments in building community wealth, in increasing the homeownership of Black, Latino, and Asian immigrants, and eliminating zoning laws that tend to keep people out, enhancing tenant protections, and implementing anti-displacement efforts, as well as investing in housing trust funds, which work to increase and sustain and maintain affordable housing, creating workforce programs, and investing in our transportation system, which is inequitable, and you don't have to go far to see that in terms of how different lines and where they lead to different areas of the city, how they're disinvested depending on where, where you're hopping on and off on the L, for instance. Like I mentioned before, eliminating public housing repair backlogs, as well as investing in a national recovery that is focused on infrastructure and the environment, which includes clean water funds, rural rental housing programs, economic development, disaster recovery programs. On the next slide, we'll see more with COVID relief and administrative actions. So in terms of administrative actions, I want to start with that because then I will lead with talking about what recently passed in Congress. And so the previous administration worked really hard behind the scenes to weaken fair housing and to make it harder for people to access housing. And so there were rule changes that bypass Congress that an administration can do to change the ways that things are run. And so, for example, a key example that you have likely all heard of was banning discussions of racism and diversity in settings that receive federal funds. And so that was the one of the administrative rule changes, which has since been reversed by executive action that President Biden took. There is the reentry and housing guidance given that stopped being circulated by the previous administration. There's the equal access rule change that made it okay for instance, for homeless shelters to place you based on their perception of your gender as opposed to your gender identity. There is also a rule change making living in public housing a public charge, which basically makes it harder for you to get your green card. As well as a rule about mixed immigration families living in public housing. So as it stands, someone with undocumented status can live cannot be counted towards housing assistance, but can live in the house. And so that would ban people, this rule change would ban people from doing that. As well as disparate impact, which has to do with the intent of discrimination. And so disparate impact says, no, we don't have to have someone who maliciously intends to discriminate, but certain policies just have disparate impacts on communities, even if there is no intent of discrimination. And so saying, I'm not going to take any Social Security income, like say I'm a landlord, I'm not going to rent to anyone who has Social Security income. You may not be intentionally trying to keep, older Americans from renting, but in many ways you will be doing that if you implement like a blanket rule like that. Just one example. And then affirmatively furthering fair housing, which requires communities to receive federal funds to really make a plan to desegregate and to tackle racial segregation. And so some of these were administrative actions taken by the previous administration, which the New Deal for Housing says we need to just undo this and make sure that none of these are in the books or still in the rulemaking process. Public charge has been refuted. This was actually one that the previous administration was fighting in court, and so that is no longer moving forward. And like I mentioned before, the systemic racism and sexism has been reversed. In terms of COVID relief, the disparate impacts of COVID-19 on Black, Indigenous, and immigrant people has to be remedied, prioritizing aid to communities that have been most harmed. Community Change Action has been advocating for at least $100 billion in rent relief, $75 billion in homeownership relief, and having an eviction moratorium until the end of the pandemic. The playbook explicitly demands that eviction moratorium be automatically triggered during any state of emergency, right? And so instead of having us to continuously push eviction moratoriums out, like for instance, our CDC eviction moratorium will end at the end of this month. And nationwide, all those localities and states have done work to expand them locally, and so we'd have to continue to push that date, but the playbook really emphasizes the need for it to be automatically triggered until the end of the crisis. Another relief is expanding housing and health initiatives through like task force, making sure that we're looking at health and racial inequity combined. Adding 100,000 new units to housing choice voucher was another policy recommendation. And the next slide, you'll see what recently happened last week, what passed by Congress in the American Rescue Plan, and which included $21 billion in rental assistance. In total, I believe it was about $45 billion towards housing. And most of it went to rental assistance, $10 billion to homeowners to prevent foreclosure, and $5 billion towards housing choice vouchers, as well as assistance through like home programs and money towards like low-income home energy assistance programs as well as specific money for Native communities and rural housing, as well as housing counseling. And on the next slide, we'll see how the New Deal for Justice has been rolled out with, with our partners. And so after the document was drafted, we came back to our community partners and we continued to analyze and discuss what would be our top priorities. And so, like any organizer will tell you, you can't work on 118 recommendations simultaneously. And so what are we focusing on? How are we focusing on them? How are we making sure that people across the country, that we're changing the conversation across the country, mainly seeing housing as a basic human need and ensuring that many of these priorities reach the people who they need to reach. And so we had one-on-ones, we had meetings with community partners, and we, one of the things that I think we did particularly well is creating opportunities for everyday leaders, grassroots leaders to share their stories. And on the next slide, you'll see some of the activities that leaders and partners have been involved in, including radio engagements, including opinion pieces. Here we have Andronika Morris from Housing NOLA to talk about, she was interviewed in this piece about her involvement as an advisor on the New Deal for Housing Justice. And here she talks about the need for people to be a focus instead of corporations, the need to making sure that we see housing as a basic human need, and the need for federal housing action. The next slide, we'll see other opinion pieces by Idalia and Brooke, who we mentioned earlier, really telling their stories. These are two leaders from two of our resident action organizing networks. The first is RUN in California, Residents United Network, and the second is RAP, Resident Action Project in Washington. And here they tell their stories. One of these op-eds was published entirely in Spanish. And so our communications team at Community Change helped these grassroots leaders to both connected them to the outlets, help pitch their stories, but also help them to develop and create drafts of their message using a lot of the values that we hold in common around housing justice and what that would look like. And the next slide, you'll see yours truly also engaging in some of this work with an interview with Rising Up with Sonali when the playbook was first unveiled, as well as a roundtable that I participated in. Was it last week or 2 weeks ago? I don't know, time flies. March 10th, where I discussed with folks from the Movement for Black Lives and Liberation in a Generation. Jeremy Greer from Liberation in a Generation actually was an author of the racial justice chapter. And so we talked about the overlap between Movement for Black Lives and the New Deal for Housing, as well as the Breathe Act. And so we had a conversation, about making sure that leaders of color are supported, right? Like movement leaders. I talked about, in particular, supporting the leadership development of women of color. Women of color have led all social justice movements in our history, but we see less of women of color in leadership positions. I mean, we're seeing more of it now, but we need to invest in the leadership development of women of color. At Community Change, we have leadership development programs like Power 50, which supports mid-career women in movements to develop their leadership, as well as the Women's Fellowship, which focuses on women who've had contact with the criminal justice system. Anyway, let's go to the next slide because I don't like seeing myself on the screen. So the next slide, we can see another example of how our partners are sharing their stories. Congresswoman Ilhan Omar's bill for rent cancellation, for instance, we connected two leaders from DC who would benefit from the bill to her office to share her stories. And if you can click, you'll see some of their quotes. Next slide, please. We can just take a quick look at some of their contributions. So for instance, Fabian and Elena said, talked about how she immigrated to the US 20 years ago, and they both worked in restaurants. She talked about not qualifying for unemployment or rental assistance and being behind on her rent for 4 months. And so I'll just quote her. She said, "We are uninsured and I'm having to decide whether I seek the healthcare I need or continue to fall further behind on rent. And I fear that we will never catch up and I will be evicted with the eviction moratorium ends. Canceling rent is the only way I can stay housed." And so, just again, ensuring that people with lived experiences are sharing their stories so that we can advance policies that can support them in this current housing crisis. On the next slide, we will see transition to talk about how our local state partners are taking action and how they're fighting to uplift many of the policies and recommendations named in the New Deal for Housing. First is Casey Tenants, which launched the Zero Eviction campaign in an effort to halt evictions and also raise awareness that even with the national eviction moratorium, evictions were still happening. And so protesters blocked entrances to two of the Jackson County courthouses. They interrupted conference call hearings, and they rallied outside of homes of judges. Here you see on the right, shame on Judge Stockdale, 835 eviction hearings, 351 eviction judgments. And this is all during eviction moratorium. On the next slide, you'll see ROC residents organized for change in Oregon, who helped to successfully secure a statewide eviction moratorium, in coalition with many other groups, to extend a moratorium until the end of June, right, which is further than our national moratorium. And so, I also want to make really clear that a moratorium does not prevent evictions. I recently just saw a clip by Dr. Rosenblatt, who explained this like clear as day. It doesn't prevent evictions. It really, it really just postpones them. And so we have to reckon with the fact that that at the end of the moratorium, people will be even more at risk of eviction, and think of solutions like rent cancellation altogether. So in the last slide, to showcase some of our partners, you'll see Washington Can organizing around good cause evictions protections, making really good use of the Bernie Sanders meme that went around from the presidential inauguration. And, Washington Can recently helped to pass eviction protections, making sure that people are just giving a 20-day notice for no reason, asking them to leave, which happens throughout the state of Washington and many other places, and is perfectly legal. And so, these are just some examples of how, our state and local partners continue to fight for eviction protections, for tenant protections in general, ensuring that renters and homeowners don't lose their homes as a result of the pandemic. And they also continue to be really mindful about how federal policies are affecting them at the local level. And particularly now, as we roll out a lot of federal funds, $1.9 trillion was passed in this most recent American Rescue Plan. And so how is that money getting spent, and really holding both the federal government accountable, but the local government accountable as well for the managing of those funds. In terms of upcoming plans listed on the next slide, we will be planning a congressional briefing on housing, making sure housing is seen as infrastructure. And this is to really influence the infrastructure bill that will be coming up next. We anticipate being introduced, and we'll continue to have town halls and support our partners to have town halls and local actions. And I know I'm running short on time here, but I want to just quickly mention some really exciting projects happening at Community Change and with our partners, having to do with changing the narrative. And so there's this ongoing messaging work around the Housing Justice Narrative Fellowship. And I'll just give you a quick intro. So on the next slide, you'll see the website where you can go to get more information about the housing narrative work. That's housingnarrative.org. And this shares the findings from research done across the country, geographically represented, as well as engaging with folks from different demographic groups, different ages, different political affiliations. In total, it was there are 52 interviews conducted, 11 focus groups held, and over 1,000 surveys done to try to understand where people stand in terms of housing, and what are some of the messages that work in gaining support for some of the policies that we care about. And so on the next slide, you'll see some of the key findings from this research that we did in collaboration with Cossyleon and Race Forward as a next step to the race and class narrative work that we've done in the past with them. And so what we found with them is that, you know, people see a clear role for government to intervene in housing, and some of the messages that work based on poll testing and these interviews and these focus groups is that we need to frame housing justice work as a basic human need. And you've heard me say this over and over throughout this presentation, right? We need to ensure that we did change the conversation, right? The common sense around housing, around this, versus seeing housing as a commodity. And this really helps to fight this individualized problem of seeing housing crisis as an individual problem or family issue, when really it's a systemic issue that in many ways has designed to keep people out based on the color of your skin or where you grew up or where you were born or you know, your gender identity. It's a gendered issue, right? It absolutely is, and we need to continue to talk about it in this way. What else works? Anti-discrimination framework, making sure that in our messaging around racial justice, we're saying like nobody should be discriminated against because of the color of their skin, because of where they live. Like this works, and this works across our base, across persuadables, and across people who are not in our base. So people who don't agree with us on policies, but can agree with us on messaging. And so housing, making sure that we are looking at a holistic approach to housing. It intersects with economic security. It's a pathway to racial equity. And importantly, leading with our values. On the next slide, you'll see some of the values that worked, including talking about children, right? All children deserve a roof over their head and a safe place to live. 75% of people that were surveyed strongly agreed to this, and this is across political lines. You know, safe shelter is a basic human need. Without a job, you're likely to struggle, right? So many of these values that were tested resonated with people across demographic lines, across geographic lines, across political lines. And so we are at Community Change are working to share some of this research with our community partners. We've created a fellowship where over 30 community partners are participating, and where we're sharing tools for messaging, helping and supporting them to share their stories in a way that can help expand our base and can help to gain more support, more public support for government intervention in dealing with our housing crisis. And I will be continuing to document the learnings. I've been doing a mini ethnographic project, sitting in on this fellowship, and you know, looking at the ways in which both we share the research findings, but also how these messages then are incorporated into grassroots actions. So Community Change is providing support for these actions through money and through technical support and through ideas and with organizers on staff to incorporate these messages into actions. Many of them are virtual, but nonetheless, they're you know, garnering attention. And I'll continue to take field notes at these meetings during these fellowship phases. And then I will conduct interviews with participants, and we'll continue to work with state cohorts working on local campaigns. And so that concludes the presentation portion. This last slide has my contact information. Happy to take questions. You know, this is just one area of what I've been involved in at Community Change. I'm happy to talk about my work in research and evaluation more broadly. I'm happy to talk about my work with the Women's Women's Fellowship and Women of Color Spaces and Power 50 leadership development programs as well. And, and connected to many of the skills that I learned at Curl, that I hope many of you on this call that are students are taking advantage of all of the knowledge and experience there is in the room with working with communities to do research to make our world a better place for future generations. Because really that's what I'm in it for. And so happy to open it up for questions if we want to, how we want to go about doing that. But
thanks, Jennifer. I'll do my best to moderate some of the questions, but people shouldn't be overly shy on this. Thank you so much for your presentation, and I look forward to a good conversation.